Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third and final event in Parallel Dreams, Korean and Korean American Issues Through Film. This webinar series is being co-hosted by the Institute for Korean Studies at Indiana University and the Embassy of the Republic of Korea in the USA. My name is Seung-Kyung Kim. I am Korea Foundation Professor in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures and Director of the Institute for Korean Studies at Indiana University. Our webinar series features issues connecting Korea and the US, covering transnational adoption, race and ethnic issues, and immigrant lives. The theme of tonight's webinar is Narratives of Korean Immigrants in the US and focuses on the Academy Award-winning film Minari. Minari has been making headlines ever since it premiered at Sundance in January of last year. The storyline follows a Korean immigrant couple as they move from California to rural Arkansas in the 1980s. Jacob Yi, played by Steven Yeun, dreams of success as a farmer, while his wife Monica, played by Han Ye-ri, is much less enthusiastic about the move. They have two American-born children, 7-year-old David, played by Alan Kim, and his older sister, Anne, played by Noel Kate Jo. And finally, Monica's mother, Sunja, played by Yoon Yo-jung, moves in to help with childcare. While Minari received widespread acclaim, it received the U.S. Dramatic Grand Jury Prize and the U.S. Dramatic Audience Award at Sundance. Its trailblazing nature can best be appreciated by observing how the movie industry struggled with categorizing it. While the immigration story it tells is quintessentially American, much of its dialogue is in Korean, and the main actors are all Korean or Korean American. Thus, for the 78th Golden Globe Awards, it was nominated and won in the category Best Foreign Language Film. The Academy of Motion Pictures has a poor record of recognizing actors of East Asian descent, with no acting nominations for even the international blockbuster Parasite. Nevertheless, Minari received 2 acting nominations for the 2021 Academy Awards: Best Actor for Steven Yeun and Best Supporting Actress for Yoon Yo-jung, and Yoon won the award. Given the importance of the acting in bringing in emotional force to these ordinary lives, the recognition was well-deserved. Tonight, we have 2 panelists and a moderator who will facilitate their conversation: Professors Edward T. Chang, Chang-Ne Lee, and Susan Huang. Let me briefly introduce them. Edward T. Chang is Professor of Ethnic Studies and founding director of the Young-Ok Kim Center for Korean American Studies at the University of California at Riverside. He is a leading expert on the Los Angeles riots, race relations between Korean and African American communities, and Korean Americans. A prolific researcher, Professor Chang has published 11 books, 7 edited volumes, and numerous articles. His latest books are The Korean Americans, A Concise History, published in 2019, and Pachapa Camp, The First Koreatown in the United States, published in 2018. Chang-Ne Lee is a novelist and the Ward W. and Priscilla B. Woods Professor in the Department of English at Stanford University. He is the author of 6 novels: Native Speaker in 1995, A Gesture Life 1999, Aloft 2004, The Surrender 2010, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, On Such a Full Sea in 2014, and his most recent novel, My Study Abroad in 2021. His works have won numerous awards and citations. In 2021, he was recognized for lifetime achievement in the novel with an award of merit from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, as well as elected as a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Our moderator, Dr. Susan Huang, is an assistant professor in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures at Indiana University. She specializes in contemporary Korean literature and culture and is currently working on a book manuscript entitled Uncaged Songs, Culture and Politics of Protest Music in South Korea. Thank you again for joining us tonight, and I will turn to Professor Huang now.
Thank you, Seung-kyung, for the introduction. Good evening, everyone. My name is Susan Huang, and I'll be moderating tonight's event. Following the discussion with our speakers, Professors Edward Chang and Chang Lee, who are both joining us tonight virtually from the West Coast, we will have a short Q&A session with those in the audience. So at any point during the webinar, please use the Q&A tool on the Zoom interface to submit your questions for our speakers. Many reviews of the film Minari have really remarked on its resonance as a quote unquote uniquely American story, which is interesting in and of itself, but it also found resonance with viewers like myself, a Korean American immigrant, both sort of within the trajectory of the Korean American experience or the Asian American experience as well. So I thought we might begin with a brief historical background into the Korean American experience to help us contextualize the film a little bit. And to also facilitate how we think about the film in terms of how it resonates both within the immigrant narrative, but also departs from that in its own unique ways. So I'd like to prompt Edward to help us start the discussion.
Okay, hello everyone. Edward Chang, the Professor of Ethnic Studies. I'm honored to be invited to give a presentation on Korean American history, identity, and community today, along with Professor Lee. And I was told to present about 10 minutes of Korean American history. So I will go very quickly and try to end my talk within 10 minutes. And of course, this is the map of Asia. Korea is located right here in Korean Peninsula, surrounded by 4 major superpowers: Russia, China, Japan, and there are 25,000 or more US troops stationed in South Korea today. So this is the only place in the entire world that are surrounded by the 4 major superpowers and still divided along 38th parallel. I think this is a very important geographical background for some of you to understand. And I have been teaching Korean American history for more than 30 years, and I tell my students, unless people know their history, their identity is anchorless. I'm a firm believer of this, so I emphasize importance of learning history. And Korean immigration history can be divided into 4 different unique stages. Officially, Korean immigration is recognized as it began in January 13, 1903, with arrival of a little more than 100 Korean immigrant laborers in Honolulu, Hawaii, and that is recognized as official Korean immigration to the United States. However, before 1903, there were several hundred Koreans who landed, and here in the United States, there were political exiles, students, and ginseng merchants. And they primarily went to Chinatown to sell Korean ginseng is well known. And between 1903 and 1924, where all Asian immigration was banned because of a racial discrimination, about 8,000 Korean immigrants landed in Hawaii as well as mainland United States. They include laborers, picture brides, and picture brides are about 800 to 1,000 Korean women who decided to marry Korean men here in the United States through exchange of photographs, and some political exiles and students. Like I said, Korean immigration stopped as of 1924, and there was a few diplomats and students arriving between 1924 and 1950. Of course, 1950 outbreak of Korean War triggered Korean immigration again, and they include war brides, orphans, students, diplomats, and others. However, majority of Korean immigrants that we know of today are post-1965 immigrants. In 1965, the United States passed Immigration Act of 1965, and for the first time, it's not based on racial preference, and yet I gave 20,000 immigrants per country from all over the world, and Korean immigrants certainly took advantage of this new immigration law, and they are known as new urban immigrants, which is atypical immigrants. Historically, traditionally, immigrants are very poor rural background, uneducated. But post-1965, Korean immigrants were highly educated. Many of them came from Seoul and other urban areas and professional middle-class background. So they are the core of a Korean immigrant community today. And of course, since I don't have much time, I really cannot describe much about Korean community in early era, but Korean community in Hawaii, they were mostly scattered, dispersed, different sugar plantation in different islands. So they were not able to really establish their own Korean settlement until after they came out of a plantation camps in 1907, 1908. Of course, they faced many culture shocks, and they brought with them traditional values, clothing, and food, and turned out to be very mediocre plantation workers at best. They were not really farmers from back in Korea. And early Korean immigrant community can be summed up with two words. One, Christianity, church, and independence movement. Because Korea was colonized by Japan in 1910, Korean American community dedicated all full 100% on independence of Korea. And the Seungman Rhee, An Chang-ho, Park Yong-man, Philip An, these are some of the leaders of independence movement. And I recently published a book, The Pachapa Camp, the first Koreatown in the United States. And it happened to be where I reside over the last 30 years here in Riverside. And it was unknown until Dosan An Chang-ho established this first Korean settlement. And he's a very well-known independence leader of modern Korea. And there are tons of books and articles written about him, and very little have focused on this unknown history of Pachapa Camp. And it was located in downtown Riverside. And if any of you ask more questions, I can go on. Of course, Korean immigration pretty much is stalemate by 1930s. We now begin to have second generation Korean Americans born and raised in the United States. When World War II broke out, more than 600 Korean young men and women from Hawaii, and more than 200 Korean young men and women from mainland enlisted during World War II, and many of them fought in European front. Of course, Colonel Young Kim is one of the most famous war heroes. And there were Fred O, who became ace in the Air Force. And we have Sujan An, who became the first women gunnery officer in US Navy. So we have many heroes who served during World War II. Of course, Korean War separation divided Korea. We know today has a major impact on both Korea as well as the Korean American community. Like I said before, Korean immigration resumes again with Korean women who married US servicemen and many biracial children and orphans who came to the United States as adoptees. And these war brides are critical when Korean immigration resumes again in 1965. It was based on family reunion and skill preference for the skilled workers. And this family reunion, who triggered this chain migration is primarily as many as 30–40% of Korean immigration today. If you trace or who started first, can be traced back to this war brides. So there are key elements of Korean American community. I think we need to recognize that. We need to be more inclusive of that. And yet they are still marginalized within Korean American community. Korean population in the United States were roughly about 70,000 in 1970. It jumped to 354,000 in 1990. And I'm sorry, 1980. And by 1990, it was almost 800,000 and 2,000, a little more than 1 million. And 2010, if you look at, include the combination, or 1.7 million. So I'm assuming US Census in 2020 will be closer to 2 million Korean American population. So we're talking about Korean American population from 70,000 in 1970 to close to 2 million in 2020. It's mostly immigration, although there are some second generation, but immigration was a key element of Korean American community today. And some of the characteristics of early and the recent immigrants is kind of I divided into early immigrants. Most of them are young single men, whereas post 1965, they're family based. Early immigrants were poor working class background, whereas recent immigrants were more middle class, urban, and they are heavily into small business. In fact, Korean immigrants have the highest self-employment rates in the United States today. And that explains why many Korean immigrants went into inner cities during the 1980s and 1990s and triggered interracial, interethnic conflicts with primarily African American community. And still church serves as a key function. And the church perhaps is the most important, most numerous social, economic, religious, political organization within Korean American community. And in early days, early 20th century, Asian immigrants, Korean Americans were viewed as unassimilable aliens. But today they are viewed as most assimilable, meaning model minority. So, hopefully I gave you overview of Korean immigration history in 10 minutes, and maybe it'll trigger some Q&A. And at this time, I will try to share a trailer of, where did it go? I need to go back to minority trailer. Let me try to share the screen again. Yeah, here.
새로 시작한다고 그랬잖아. 이거야. 아빠는 비가든 하나 만들 거야. 오늘
wonderful day to be in the house of the Lord. If you're here with us for the first time, please stand. What a beautiful family. Glad you're here.
Daddy like that new farm. He draws things good, doing things right.
Yes. 애들은 할머니랑 같이 방 쓰는 거 싫어한다던데. I don't like grandma. 걔는 안 그래요. 한국이니까. Grandma feels like Korea.
야, 뭐라고? Grandma smell?
이따가 나갈 거야. 애들이 위해서라도 한 번 더 생각해 볼 수 있잖아.
이제도 한 번쯤 아빠가 뭔가 해내는 거 봐야 될 거 아니야.
걔나 이거 봐. 할머니는 진짜 할머니 같지 않아요. 할머니 같은 게 뭔데? 쿠키도 만들고 나폴라도 안 입고 남자 팬티도 안 입고.
Need to find water somewhere. If that soil ain't wet, we're gonna lose the crop.
그때 말 기억나? 미국에 가서 서로를 구해주자고 했던 거.
기억해. 어이, pretty boy, pretty boy. I'm not pretty. I'm good looking.
Okay, I guess I'll turn over back to Susan.
Well, thank you, Edward, for sharing that brief but very illuminating history of the major arcs that define the Korean American history of immigration. So I think in light of your discussion, the film takes us in an interesting to an interesting place that both sort of resonates with that the broader arcs of the history, but also departs from it in its own unique artistic way. And I was just saying this to Chang earlier, but having now watched the film again on big screen, I was just astounded again by the beauty of the film and the striking the visuals and the emotional takes that the film sort of encapsulates really well. So as much as it's about this family that is with the character Jacob E, who plays the father, who's played by Stephen Yeun. It is about that pursuit of the American dream. And, that is essentially what takes this family from California, which is notably more immigrant friendly, to this place in rural Arkansas in the 1980s. And starts this farm on a large plot of land that, as we learn early on in the film, is cheaper, but more promising by comparison, but has also come to be considered somehow undesirable or presents its own challenges for farming and his garden or horticultural purposes. So I wanted to ask both of you, how does the film explore this entrenched narrative of immigrants and this pursuit of the so-called American dream? How does it present itself through Jacob's family? And perhaps we can start with Chang.
Yeah, thank you, Susan, and thank you, Edward, for that brief history. Actually, some of those things that you mentioned, I wasn't actually aware of, particularly the picture brides. I know that was something that the Chinese community had in its history, but I didn't know about Koreans. But I want to echo what Susan said about the film. I saw it recently on a plane last week and twice, and there's so much about the film that presents as immediately familiar, and yet what I like so much about the film was how it defied certain expectations and conventions. Of course, any film with immigrant family who doesn't speak the native, the prevailing language is going to present them as being alone and isolated in an unfamiliar land, an unfamiliar place. And of course, that immediately is right there. You know, all immigrant stories have that as an initial tension, and a natural one. And as many of us know who are immigrants, it is a real tension to be in a place where you're not known, you don't belong, and there may even be, you know, some enmity towards you. But what this film does very quickly, I think, it it shows them in this place, and I think because of the ways that, and we'll talk about this later, I think Susan has an interest in talking about this. It's not an immediately unwelcoming place. It's a strange place, unfamiliar, but we're not presented with an immediate sort of, you know, kind of some sort of outside malice in terms of characterizations of local people, or a certain kind of, you know, sort of general malaise that the place has, that and in terms of conflict with this family. The conflicts are, as Susan mentioned, for me, very interesting. It's just perhaps a kind of haunted or bad luck piece of land, and that this family, mostly Jacob, is trying to forge something out of nothing. And that's, of course, very familiar. And I don't want to talk too much right now, but initially that was my feeling about the film, how familiar it was, and also how it defied my initial expectations of where it would go.
Edward?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this film is just claimed as being the uniquely American story. You know, I've talked to many Korean immigrants themselves, and they said nothing special. Their attitude was, I don't want to, you know, it didn't move them. It was too typical for what they went through. So it was totally opposite reaction I got from many Korean immigrants themselves. And to them, it was not extraordinary story at all. It was, you know, typical immigrant story for them. So nothing special. But, you know, moving from California to Arkansas remind me of a typical Korean immigrant patterns. You know, from those early Korean immigrants who landed in Hawaii in 1903 and 1905, and more than 1,000 of them decided to come to San Francisco area and relocated in Riverside, and later on to Ridley and Dinuba, Willows, Sacramento, or even Colorado, Nebraska. And so we see this pattern of Korean immigrants willing to relocate anywhere if they can realize their American dreams. We see the same pattern again post-1992 after LA civil unrest. You know, Korean community in Los Angeles was devastated, and many of them lost their American dreams overnight. And many decided to relocate to Las Vegas, Atlanta, Dallas. And so if you look at the Korean American community, Korean immigrants are the most dispersed Asian American group in the United States. Other Asian Americans are primarily East Coast and West Coast. Whereas the Korean immigrants, you see a large Korean community in Dallas, Atlanta, and many southern cities, as well as Midwest. So, you know, this is a very typical Korean immigrant pattern, and I will talk about more, but it really shows the Korean immigrants are most risk-taking immigrant than any other group that I know of, particularly post-1965. And that's the reason why many of them went into inner city and opened up liquor stores, grocery markets, and no one wanted to go in, too dangerous. So this film reminded me of that particular part.
Yeah, what I wanted to add too about about how I was surprised by certain moves the film makes. Because early on in the film, they meet while they're sexing the chicks. They meet another Korean person there, and in a typical film or another kind of film, that relationship and that character would have proven, I think, more important, right? That person may have been a way that an introducer of that for the family to the local culture, to its people, maybe a certain kind of refuge. She even talks about a Korean church that they go to, but it turns out that that's not part of the story. It turns out they also don't go to the Korean church. And then soon enough, we also hear from Jacob about a certain kind of disaffection for city Koreans, the Koreans back in Los Angeles, who maybe that he couldn't trust, which of course ends up being the case with the vegetable order that his Korean clients, they cancel their order. So it's a typical story in that they're isolated, but of course we know through Jacob's character that it's also a choice of a kind of self-isolation from not the Korean community and tradition, but just he seems to need to move away from it. That seems to be a part of, at least in his calculus, of how he can endure and survive and maybe blossom. And I think that's very interesting.
So I think both of you brought up really interesting points about the film, that it both resonates in a very typical sense, and it did with me especially too. And I'm just to share a very personal detail, my own father in the 90s had at one point very seriously considered moving out to Colorado from California, from Los Angeles, because he wanted to seek new opportunities. And then my mother held him back. So after packing up his Ford Crown Victoria, overnight he had to unload everything, and they decided to settle in LA. So in that sense, it, like Edward said, it does, bring up that sort of that typical story of going to different places, different states, unknown places in order for new opportunities. And we definitely do see that with Jacob. At the same time, as Chang brought up, there are ways in which the film does defy and almost resists getting into that typicality or falling into that typicality of the immigrant narrative, and the specific ways in which they insert that character of in the hatchery, the Korean immigrant who had already been there, but then disassociates the family very distinctly from becoming a communalizing with that immigrant character. Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about how this relationship between Sunja, played by ever so great Yoon Ye-jung, and David, her grandson, Jacob's son, and how the film almost seems to be tracing this rooting process for the family in rural Arkansas. And they have all these sort of awkward moments that are sort of beautifully inserted in in critical moments of the film, like during the Sunday service, and Jacob working with this Pentecostal farm help. And things like that. But the one thing that seems to be growing throughout the story, the film, is the relationship between Sunja and David. And I was wondering if both of you could discuss how this intergenerational dynamic and intercultural dynamic is operating in the film. And here, maybe we can start with Edward.
Okay. Well, intergenerational conflict. This is, I think, one of the most important story that are not told within Korean American community. When I assign a paper to my students in my Korean American studies class, more than half of a Korean American student would like to write about conflict with their parents. and many of them have serious issues. So, the film really doesn't depict the parents and sons and daughters. Instead, it's more of a grandson versus a 할머니, grandma. But it really shows how immigrant community are going through and how they are trying to resolve these issues. And the immigrants, typically their frame of reference is Korea. They were born in Korea, they grew up in Korea. What they are familiar with is Korean culture, very hierarchical, very male dominant, Confucian value oriented. Whereas, younger generation who are growing up in the United States, their frame of reference is American value, American culture. It clash, culture clash is very typical of all immigrant community, and much more so perhaps in Korean American community, because we have so many Korean immigrant parents employed in self-employed. Therefore, they are working all the time, and unable to provide typical parents guidance to their children, because they are working from, I know many of the liquor store owners in Los Angeles, they work from 6 a.m. to 2 a.m. next morning, 20 hours a day, unable to provide this parental guidance. And many times, Korean students grow up on their own. You're on your own, right? And not only culture clash without any proper guidance, therefore it creates frictions. And I think I've seen many Korean American students who wants to move away. As soon as they're college age, they want to get away from their home. I mean, it's typical, but still it's much more pronounced, much more so for Korean immigrant family. They want to get away from their parents. So I think this is a very important issue in Korean American community that are not really talked about much, but film does touch a little bit through relations between grandma and grandson. So that's a very interesting story that we need to look into more in depth.
Yeah, I think I absolutely agree. I mean, intergenerational conflict is, that's a main feature of a lot of immigrant family life. Also, of course, non-immigrant family life. Maybe it's a function in this film that the kids are quite young, and maybe the film would have a different emphasis if the kids were teenagers or college age or whatever. But again, this is for me a point of interest in the film and the way that it treats its characters and its narrative. The initial struggle between Jacob and his wife Monica is that she wants to go back to LA. She doesn't, this place that they're in seems to be too risky. Maybe she doesn't really have faith in Jacob as a farmer, rightly so. And so the grandma is introduced as someone that can assuage Monica, right, and give her both the familial comfort, but also maybe cultural comfort. So that I think is fairly, like, we can understand that would be a kind of typical move, a typical storyline. What begins to be clear to me, though, is that the grandma is not your typical grandma. She's not, she doesn't come in representing Korea, even though but in a funny way she does, like her Korean smell, which I think I remember too as a young child and going into Korean people's and other people's houses and thinking, oh my gosh, it smells different here. It's like a kimchi or something like that. But the actual details of her characterization are very interesting. How she smokes, and she shows him how to play cards, and she shoots from the hip. Her character, and I think rightly so, is fascinating and very complex, and probably why she, the actress got the award from the Academy. There was a lot of material there that, again, is not what we would typically see in your more stereotypical treatment of the grandma. And even after, he feeds her his urine as a joke, she sides with him. She sees how he's independent-minded and fierce in his own right. So it's a different kind of relationship that I think reminds us again of yes, we do have differences, but in this film, actually, she's not the person, the grandma, or the intergenerational conflict here between David and the grandma is not the central story, right? Now it's wonderful in terms of a narrative turn that, in fact, the grandma ends up becoming part of the struggle of Jacob and Monica in trying to make this farm successful, and that she becomes a linchpin in her acts, or unintentional act, through the fire of basically remaking them all. But it's not because of her Koreanness. It's not because of the culture that she brings in. It's a very just human, granular presence that she provides that, again, I really appreciated as a viewer. Yes, there are cultural aspects to her that I absolutely recognize and connected with, and but on a different level, I was just taken by the way in which this family, as a family, was interacting with each other and influencing one another, Korean or not.
So yeah, I think this brings up a good point to discuss what I think lies at the heart of not just the film itself, but how it actually has been received, at the awards and the accolades that are received, but then also the very troubling ways in which, as Seung-kyung mentioned during the introduction, they just didn't know how to categorize this film. Should it be a foreign language film because the central characters speak primarily in Korean and they feature this Korean immigrant family, or is it an American film? And so, I think something, and especially at least from the interviews generated after the award ceremonies, I felt that the director, Lee Isaac Chung, was actually very reserved and hesitant about the very attempts about categorizing this particular film. And I think this goes hand in hand with what Chang brought up just now about, the relationship is perhaps not, it actually goes beyond this intercultural, intergenerational, and it's a kind of a human to human connection that I think, in a weird way, and she loses her ability to speak if temporarily because of the stroke that the character Sunja develops in the course of the film. But as she loses the ability to actually speak, something about the family, especially David and Sunja, becomes even more thick and much more sort of complex and nuanced. So there, I think I want to talk a little bit about the sort of how Minari sort of has its own unique approach to the representation of this particular family, the Jacob-East family. And perhaps, we can even, as difficult as it is to categorically speak about the film, think about what it does for our current contemporary understanding of representing Asian American lives, representing Korean American lives. And we have been witnessing a recent huge proliferation of that, especially in mainstream media. For instance, The Farewell, the Indian matchmaking, and then we have this other Crazy Rich Asians. And then also, Korean Canadians, Kim's Convenience, and The Chair on Netflix, and now Minari. So, given the kind of, historically, we've been seeing very limited range of Asian American representation, and, always been colored by this perpetual form of othering, and a lot of them being stereotyped in certain ways. And recognizable but certain ways. So what can we make of this recent iterations of the Asian American or Korean American stories? And, again, going back to the film, in what ways do you think Minari is particularly significant in exploring or perhaps even troubling that insider-outsider dialectic that has so long structured how we perceive, how we understand that particular experience? Perhaps Edward?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the Minari represents not only immigrant story, but traditional Koreanness. Korea was colonized, invaded, Japan tried to wipe out Korean identity, language, culture, history. And between Korea and Japan, Japan and China, they face, historical oppression. And the renowned Korean historian Ham Seok-hun summed up Korean history as history of suffering. A literal translation is history of a prostitute. Despite all this, Korea has been able to maintain uniquely Korean history, identity, culture. Korean language is so different than Chinese and Japanese. And we see that pattern here in the United States as well. The early immigrants, their struggles, they had attitude. Koreans never die, never give up. I translated the more than 100 oral history of early Korean immigrants. It's all throughout the interviews. Their attitude was, we'll never give up, we'll never surrender. It's in their DNA or something. I think Minari grows anywhere water is, right? Is so resilient. So I think that represents that, resiliency, tenacity of a Korean immigrant story. But in terms of what Chang talked about, how so different, the characters are so different than typical Hollywood version, right? Hollywood have made it very typical, stereotypical image of harmony, grandma, right? Intergenerational conflict. It'll be very typical, exploiting Asian American images, and yet because it was directed by Korean American with their strong vision, the whole character development is so different. I try to stay away from being stereotyped. In the beginning of a Hollywood version, Asian Americans were so dehumanized, and Scotch tape Asians, white actors and actresses playing Asian characters. And later on was more of a hypersexual during Korean War, World War II, Vietnam. Asian women were, be viewed as a geisha girls, prostitutes, primarily hypersexual, whereas Asian men were asexual, totally opposite. In Bonanza, he's a caretaker of, household without women. He does laundering, cooking, all the domestic household chores. That was the view of Asian men in Hollywood version. And Bruce Lee decided to make his movie in Hong Kong rather than Hollywood because Hollywood producers and the directors would not allow him to have a white girl as his girlfriend in the movie. So this is total departure from Hollywood version because Hollywood profit and they wanted to exploit stereotypes of Asian men, Asian women, Asian immigrant story. But because that's the importance of about, we need to have more Asian American directors. We need to have more Asian American producers, distributors, who wants to promote their own stories. And I can tell you my own story. Stephen Young, he came to our center, Young Kim Center, 7-8 years ago. He all of a sudden he was not really well-known actor as of today, right? And he came and I'll show you the photograph we took. And he came to our center 7-8 years ago, and he wanted to do a story. Sundance, he wanted to make a movie and about Young Kim's story. Young Kim, those of you who may not know who he is, he's a Korean American who led 100th and 442nd Regimental Combat Unit during World War II. And he single-handedly captured the 2 German prisoners of war in Italian front. And based on interrogation, Allied forces attacked Rome and liberated. And he also is single-handedly responsible for recapturing town of Pisa, the Leaning Tower, without a bomb, bombing the heck out of the town. So he is one of the most remarkable story. And he wanted to make a movie. And I think he wanted to play the role of Young Kim himself, but it hasn't materialized yet. But it really shows the importance of having Asian American director, Asian American actors and actresses, not stereotypical role, but our own story. And I think, what does it mean to be American? I think that's the essence of this film. What does it mean to be American?
Yeah, what Edward's talking about, our own stories, and I think, yes, historically there has been a limited range of representation for in particularly in film and mass media of Asians. We all know that, but as our community sets down more and more roots, again, after 1965, the population boomed, and I think just given the age and the generational development, I myself was a child of 1965. My parents came in 1967. My father was a medical student, one of those, quote unquote skilled workers, middle class. And I've always been asked as a writer, what kinds of stories should we be writing? And this is from my students. What kinds of characters should we be thinking about? And I always say that, I don't think we should be talking about anything. We should be only talking about as directors, as producers, as writers, as artists, as painters, as musicians, to follow, as all artists do, your own vision. Now that, of course, that vision is rooted in something, anchored, say, in Korean culture in some ways, anchored in immigrant life in some ways, but those are truths that the artist, any artist of any type, has to deal with, right, and should deal with. So I think that this film, Minari, for me, is a wonderful example of an artist following his own particular vision about who these particular Korean immigrants are. And that's why it's such an interesting and absorbing film. He makes, Jacob, this character, he's not the typical just hardworking. He works very hard, but he's also got a real stubbornness to him. He's inviting failure, right? I mean, he doesn't take heed of the advice about finding water, which ends up being a real issue for him. He doesn't listen to his wife. So, again, I think, in a different kind of film, in a film that maybe wants, kind of neat social kind of justice or something, maybe Jacob would be fighting against some racist in the town, right? Or he'd be fighting. And I'm not saying that couldn't happen and that couldn't make a wonderful story. But this director decided, no, this is a struggle mostly between Jacob and his wife, Monica, and how they're going to forge something out of nothing, given their particular experience, their particular hopes and dreams. It doesn't mean that they're less Korean or Korean immigrant, that their immigrantness isn't there. It just means that it's harder for me as a viewer, as it should be, to categorize them. And that's what I love about the film. And that's what I always tell my students about what they should write about. Don't tell anyone, I always say, don't let anyone tell you what you need to write about. If you actually observe and review and think about your background, as all artists do of any kind, those things will come about, but in your own particular path. And that's why I think this film is special that way. And I hope that we, the other films that you mentioned, Susan, The Farewell and Crazy Rich Asians and the show Kim's Convenience and even The Chair, I mean, they all have their own little vision, and they're all different, very different things. And I think I welcome that, to tell you the truth. We need, kind of popcorn movies. We need, more sort of intellectual comedy like The Chair. We need just outright buffoonery like in Kim's Convenience. We need maybe, overblown status interested Crazy Rich Asians, taking over the world. We also need the Squid Game, right? to shock us into just, shock us into not being like in any idea about who Koreans are. It turns out we're just like other people. We do have a particular history that we have to keep mind of and that we want to honor. We have particular cultures and traditions that we want to keep mind of and honor. But that shouldn't be a limitation. That should be a point of entry into a whole world of experience. And I think this very quiet film, for me, does that in many interesting ways.
Yeah, I agree with Chang-Ray's. Artists should create your own path and vision and write about it. The problem is, though, there are so few opportunities for Asian American writers, actors, directors who try to pursue that road until now. I mean, Isaac Chang is very fortunate that he had a producer who is willing to take a risk. But, historically, so many actors, Asian American actors and actresses, the only role they were given was a stereotypical role, martial art experts or geisha girl or gangster, model minority. These were the typical role. And Stephen Yeun's character were non-existent at all, because Hollywood production was primarily about profits and primarily about exploiting stereotypes of Asian American characters. So this is a very welcome change that we have Lee Isaac Chung, who's creating his own path and story that came out in larger screen. And he's very fortunate. We need to create more opportunities like this by providing more capital, more opportunity, directors to many young talented artists who wants to pursue that road. I think we need to create more opportunities for that.
Okay, well, thank you. So, that the discussion so far exhausts the three topics that I wanted to engage us in, but we do have some time for Q&A, and we have several interesting questions that emerged from the audience. So I thought perhaps we can go through a few before we end for the evening. So one of the questions raised is about the Christian motifs. So in the film, Christian motifs, Paul as the devout Christian, Korean families, church-going scenes are present in the film. How does the Christian motif in the movie relate to the story of Korean immigrants in the United States?
Well, like I said before, the Christianity and church was the most important institution in the early Korean immigrant community. Wherever Koreans reside, first thing they do is to establish church, whether it's a Presbyterian church, a Methodist, whatever. So that's what they did in the early. And post 1965 immigrants are no different. Church is the most important social, economic, religious, cultural, educational institution in the Korean American community, no doubt about it. And in the film, they purposely chose not to go to Korean church, right? And I think it really shows typical patterns of Korean immigrants of 1970s and 80s. Like I said before, they were very highly educated, middle class, upper middle class background. Therefore, I think they thought they can do it because of we call it ethnic background as a class background. They're able to utilize their background to success without relying on other Korean immigrants. I think that was the typical pattern. And I know many Korean young students who grew up in the 70s and 80s, and their parents told not to speak Korean, instead assimilate fully, 100%. And so I know many those Korean immigrants who grew up in the 70s and 80s who became very successful professionals. Very few speak articulating Korean language because of that. The parents themselves suffered a great deal because of a language handicap. So they didn't want their children to go through what they went through. So I think this is a very important, but in the typical Korean community, still 70% of Korean immigrants go to Korean church. They go to church, even today. So it's a little bit different, motif in the film, but typical Korean immigrants, they go to Korean church. And I critique that Korean immigrant church are too hierarchical, male dominant, and evangelical, very ultra conservative. And so I think that's the reason why many second generation Korean Americans are staying away from Korean immigrant church. I think that's also important part of characteristics of church, Korean immigrant church.
Chang, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, clearly, the film is, a rejection of that very typical, connection between Korean immigrant life and the church. I know that was our life. We religiously went to church, but even though we were not religious, even though my parents really didn't, to be honest, care about the religious part of it. And so it's a very interesting point of characterization in the film for me, that Jacob decides, no, we're not going to do this. He's a very stubborn, headstrong person who whether that's Korean or not, I think it is, but that he's going to go it alone. And in fact, his rejection of of having any kind of community backing, community wisdom, community advice, suggests to me that he thinks that's actually the wrong path for him. Again, I mentioned before how he felt betrayed by certain Koreans back in Los Angeles or California. You get the sense from him that he doesn't trust Koreans.
Mhm.
And so that, again, that's another point of psyche that is unlikely, surprising, but altogether quite real to me. And as I've seen before too, I know as many Koreans, particularly second generation, who have rejected the church completely because of what Edward mentioned about it's highly conservative, often sexist, kind of snuffing of diversity. So I think it's clear, and the Christian character in the film is a sort of unhinged white guy who, of course, is very he's a wonderful character, but in some ways he's the one who's the real outsider.
Mhm. Mhm.
The local people the local white kids make fun of him, right? So it's an interesting way to the portrayal of religious
Mhm.
notions and practice again is upturned,
Mhm.
which I appreciate.
Yeah, that I think connects with one of the questions raised about the importance of the Arkansas setting and how the movie actually unfolds. And what you brought up just now, Chang, about Paul, the Pentecostal character, how he reads actually more odd and othered than the Eve family, right? So could either of you comment on the setting of the novel, the rural Arkansas?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely important to the film. You really can't have this film in the same way if it's set in Koreatown or in Flushing, Queens, because it would be an entirely different film, right? And what's great about it too is that not enough is made about the migrations that Edward mentioned about. We focus so much on urban immigrant life because that's where the concentrations are. Whereas in reality now, it's, as Edward mentioned, it's also suburban immigrant life, which is a slightly different beast. It's not, say the tight cloistered ethnic enclave that is linguistically sealed. Say the communities in Atlanta or Dallas, they're much more integrated and assimilated just because they have to be in the landscape. Now, this is one step further, of course, in rural Arkansas, where they're hardly the only non-white people around. It's interesting that there are very few Black characters, if any, in this film. That was one part of the film that I was waiting for, but I didn't quite. Maybe in that part of Arkansas there just weren't that many Black people. So the sense of isolation, I bring that up because the sense of isolation is fierce, and yet the isolation is not the kind of isolation that I thought it was going to be. When Edward screened the trailer, I remember watching the trailer before watching the film, and then there's that scene of the burning of the house, and my initial thought, of course, when I first saw the trailer, was, oh my God, the local people burn them down. They want them to leave, and right, because I've been trained by Hollywood. I've been trained by certain kinds of narratives about racial struggle and racism, and of course, it turns out the grandma, which, this is the setting in Arkansas is, I think it allows, in some sense, us to focus more on the characterizations of these individual people and their individual personalities, because it doesn't have the noise and the weight of certain expectations that maybe a more urban or suburban setting would have, given that contextually they'd be much more connected to, say, other Koreans or other Asians or other minorities. Here, they're kind of sealed off, so we have to just deal with their own interpersonal struggles, which there are many. And in fact, as I mentioned before, the only other Korean person in the film is pretty much shunted off and never seen again. It kind of removes any of those questions and puts them into this bubble in which they can't escape each other, which I think in some psychological way is faithful to a certain kind of sense of immigrant life. It certainly was for me when we were young. I felt that we were in this bubble, very safe, but also maybe a little stifling. And that the church was another bubble, safe but stifling. And this was so I think that's a way that the film was quite faithful to certain kinds of experiences.
To me, this was very atypical story because yes, there were many Korean immigrants who came to the United States as a worker visa, and chicken sexing was one-way ticket to America. So that's how why they came. But his intention to relocate to Arkansas is not to pursue this, his job of chicken section. It was his tool to settle in Arkansas, realizing rural America, which is a very atypical Korean story. Majority of Korean immigrants settled in urban cities, large cities. But his intent was to create thriving farm in Arkansas, rural Arkansas, without much connection. Although his dream was to supply it to Korean market, which failed, but it's kind of a very atypical story. So to me, it was very interesting that it took place in Arkansas rural community. So I don't know, I'm not much of a artistic person, but I'm more of a social historian. So that's the extent that I got it from the stage of Arkansas.
Yeah, so there's a question, it's a history question about post-1965 immigration. So other than the large number of war-bride immigrant situations that you mentioned, Edward, why did the non-rural Koreans want to come to the US? It seems by then, the anti-immigrant non-opportunity history of the US may have been a deterrent for people in Korea.
No, you remember Korea was a very poor country until 1990s. Mm-hmm. Korea was ruled by military dictators, mm-hmm. and oppression, poverty, and urbanization was just taking place from rural to urban migration within Korea. And there is always a threat of war, right? So the combination of all these, military, economic, political factors pushed highly educated Korean immigrants from Korea who believed their educational background, their middle-class background would enable them to succeed in America, realizing American dreams. Remember when I came to the United States in 1974 with my parents, I was told that if you go to America, you could pick up gold on the streets. That's how Korea and the United States, the gap was, economic gap. Remember, Korea was the poorest country during 1950s, so right after Korean War, and struggled throughout 60s and 70s and 80s. So Korea, today is completely different. And in fact, Korea is now, we'd like to brag that Korea is the only country, only nation during 20th century that went through colonization, military dictatorship, poverty, war, and became democratic and independent and sending aids to the different countries. They used to receive aid from the United States and United Nations. Now they are providing supply aids to poor countries. So Korea has become one of the most democratic, thriving economic power of the world today. But 30 years ago, it wasn't like that at all.
So I have a question for Chang from the audience. What are your experiences of growing up as a Korean American, in the sense, to the extent that it was reflected in your novels? How different have your experiences been from the E family experience?
Well, as I mentioned before, being a novelist isn't necessarily being a recorder of one's own history. So I just want to make sure that that's clear. These are stories that I imagine and that I, warp and change to reflect what I'm interested in terms of a storyline about certain characters. That said, as I said before, every writer, artist, creative person necessarily, draws from his or her own life, the people in it, the experiences they've had, everything they've seen. And those are not just national or ethnic experiences. Those are everything, right? And what they've read. So I guess my answer would be is that, I'm a writer. I'm also someone who is Korean American, who's had a particular history, who grew up in a particular part of the country with a certain kind of Korean American experience and Korean American friends that I always say is unique to me. I hope that now this is not to say that as Korean Americans, we don't have lots of things in common, but in the course of my life and in my teaching and with my students, particularly all the Asian American and Korean American students I've had, every one of us is so different in terms of our experiences. Some of us came when we were 2.5, like myself. Others came after they and learned English as a 12-year-old with a very different kind of family. Grew up in a rural area in the Midwest, in the Midwest, or in Koreatown, or my cousins, the first cousins grew up in Flushing. They came as later immigrants, learning English late in life, and lived in Flushing, Queens, where they didn't have to learn English to get by. So, so that to me is indicative of how different our lives are, and to try to say that Korean Americans or Asian Americans have this common experience is only true to a somewhat uninteresting extent. The most interesting extent, as the film may suggest, is that we all have these different little lives and psyches and everything like that. So those things have gone into my novels, and some of those concerns that I've had as a young kid, as a young man, as a father, as a professor, as someone who, those things come into some of my work for sure. Can I trace them exactly? No. I'm sure maybe a critic could if they had my biography, but that's just part of being a person who is creating things, and in that way I'm probably no different than anyone else. So that would be my answer to the question. Was there a second part of the question? I don't remember, but I'm sorry.
It was, I think you did mention, end up answering it, how
Yeah.
different, the difference between your own experiences and those that we see manifest in the E family.
Oh, in the Yi family. Yeah, I mean, again, lots of common, one of the things that really struck me was, there's a lot of tension between husband and wife. And not that there isn't, there's obviously always tensions between husband and wives and couples of every kind. But I remember feeling, watching the film, that that my parents had, when they had struggles, they were a very loving couple. But when they had struggles, it wasn't necessarily about each other. It was also about the context in which we were living. It was also because they were afraid sometimes, or uncertain, because they felt isolated in the culture, and they didn't know people, and they didn't know how things should go for their kids, what they should do, because they had no way of, we were slightly isolated from, there were not really any Korean American families in the town we lived in. And so I think a lot of their tensions in the film were tensions that I remembered that my parents had. Again, they loved each other, but circumstances and the larger context in which they existed had an influence on their personal lives. And I think a lot of people who aren't immigrants and who aren't newcomers to a place, that's something that they don't quite understand. They don't understand how influential and the force of that energy that comes from the outside world, especially when the world is not your own. And that's something that, I remember very distinctly.
Thank you. So we have time for one last question, and this is for Professor Chang, Edward. So the banner behind you is too striking to not mention. So, between you, there's Black Lives Matter and Stop Asian Hate. How are they connected, in your opinion?
Oh boy. Historically, Asian experiences, particularly here in California, is very connected. Remember, until World War II, there weren't that many African Americans in California, but California thrived based on Mexican and Asian immigrant labor in terms of the capitalistic development. So Asian immigrants pretty much occupied the hierarchy of what African Americans occupied in the South until 1960s. And Asian immigrants were only allowed to work as a source of cheap labor in California, agriculture industry, service industry. In California, you saw typical sign, no Chinese and no dogs allowed in restaurants. And they would refuse to serve food to Asian immigrants during the 30s, 40s, and the 50s. So, it coincides with the capitalistic development of how California emerged from one of the most racist states as far as an anti-Asian hate is concerned, to most liberal when it comes to immigration and other racial policies. So it's distinctly connected. And post 1992, I find very interesting that when we had a lot of this protest about a year ago in Los Angeles, we had a very interesting phenomenon that the protesters purposely chose to protest in white affluent communities, Hollywood, West Hollywood, Santa Monica, Beverly Hills, and they chose that white neighborhood and saying the racism, you have to be responsible and take ownership of it. Whereas in 1992, Koreatown burned. The total contrast, what happened between 1992 and 2020. So it is connected, very deeply rooted, anti-Blackness, anti-Asian. I think it unfortunately is a part of the history of American history. And we need to fight against it, obviously, particularly institutionalized form of discrimination, racism. I think it is intertwined, and we need to really understand, unmask whiteness and white racism. Racism is a product of whiteness. And I think we need to have a clear understanding of that history and how whiteness privileged white immigrants, whereas if you are not white America, you are subject of discrimination and racism. I think we have to understand historical evolution of that particular unfortunate history.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so with that, I think we have to conclude for the night. That's all the time that we have. So with this, we conclude our 3-part webinar series, Parallel Dreams. Thank you so much again to Professors Chang Lee and Edward Chang for joining us tonight and lending your insight into not only the sort of the broader context of Korean American experience, but also about the very depth and artistry of the film and the implications that it has for how we might envision a more colorful and more diverse forms of the Korean American, Asian, as well as American experience. I also want to thank all those in the audience today for attending the webinar and for raising important questions for our speakers. The webinar will be made available on YouTube for those who were unable to attend tonight. So thank you again to everyone, and I hope this is a wonderful evening for you all. Thank you. Thank you, Edward. Thank you, Chang Lee.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.